Okay, today's scripture reading is Exodus 20, verse 12. Exodus 20, verse 12. And I'll be reading from the New King James Version. And mine reads, "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land, which the Lord your God is giving you."
Good morning and happy Sabbath, everyone. You people are really hard to work for. I want to tell you, I've been in charge of the personal testimonies, and I had a couple of them lined up, and I missed one day, and you snuck in an extra one that I was going to use for today. And then I had another lady lined up that had offered to give her testimony, and you voted her out of the church and sent her to Grand Island. So what you're going to get is my father's personal testimony through me, because you've already heard my testimony, and so this is what I have to say, and it relates back to honoring your father and your mother. And my father and mother were very easy to honor. They were very good parents. My dad was so cool under pressure that it's unbelievable. Even when we were acting up a little bit, or if he had trouble with truck drivers, he always kept his cool. And my brother inherited that from him, but I didn't inherit that. And I'm very disappointed that I didn't. And my wife often says, it's a good thing I wasn't there when she was raising the kids. It was better that I was a truck driver and gone, because I have very little patience for kids that aren't paying attention. My mother was a great support to the family, and she took me fishing a whole lot more times than my dad did. And after I was married, and my wife would blow up once in a while and get to yelling at me when I deserved it, or even if I didn't sometimes, but she wouldn't keep her cool. But when my mother had problems, like my wife, she would clean house. You know, that's what a woman does when she's mad. She cleans house, in case you guys hadn't noticed that yet. But my mother never yelled or argued or discussed anything, any trouble, complaint she had with my dad in front of my brother and I. And as far as I know, they might have never had a fight. Because once, shortly after I got married, my dad, or maybe when I was going to get married, he said, now, some people have a lot of trouble adjusting to each other. He said, I was very fortunate, your mother and I didn't have a hard adjustment. And he said, most people do, and so you watch out for that and stay calm. Which I did most of the time. I'm pretty good at staying calm with adults, but small children, when you've told them 6 times and they still bouncing the ball off the wall, you know, it just, I have a little trouble with that. But my father was pretty much a workaholic. He worked long and he worked hard, but he was driven to that by having to watch his father lose the family farm back in the 30s. Grandpa finally lost the farm, I think, in 34, just as things were about to turn around. And Dad didn't ever want to be in that situation. Grandpa Vernon had got this rash around his stomach, went almost all the way around his back. I forget what they call it. Shingles. Yeah, he got shingles. And it was hot in the summertime, and he had to work in the field with the mules and couldn't quit, because you just had to work every hour to make a small penny. But my dad, while he was in school, he worked for a neighbor that raised turkeys and chickens and such. And whenever the rain would come up, why, the boss and his son would go to town and leave Dad out there to do the chores by himself. And what kind of finally brought that job to a halt was they went to town, the boss and his son, and they were good friends. Dad and the son were close schoolmates. And this old farmer, later in years, when he retired and moved to town, he lived right next door to Dad and Mom and us. And they went to town one day and said for Dad to stay and clean the chicken house. And the chicken house didn't need to be cleaned too bad. It wasn't a terrible job, and Dad did it. But he decided then there was better things in life. And years later, he told old Howard, he said, "You know, Howard, I wouldn't have amounted to anything if you'd have been kind of a decent boss." But he said, "You were a tough boss," and he said, "I had to break out on my own." So, but anyway, my dad, at that point, he was in the 11th grade in school, and he quit school, and he went to the unemployment office, and there were several people there, but he got up to the booth and told this lady that he needed a job. And she says, "Well, what kind of a job are you looking for?" And it kind of set him back because he wasn't sure. But he said, "Well, I can drive a truck." Okay, she said she'd give him a paper to fill out. She said, "Go over to this desk and fill out this paper." The next man in the line behind him was a man that had been hauling fill for the airport. They were building this airport here in town at the time. And he came up there. He was done with this project here. And he had a project hauling fill for the Boulder Dam out in Colorado. And he told this lady at the desk, he said he needed some truck drivers that would be willing to go to Colorado to work on this project. And she said, "Well, that boy over there filling out she said, "That young man over there filling out the paperwork says he's a truck driver." And so the man hired Dad on the spot, and they went to Colorado, and Dad was driving a dump truck hauling large rocks for fill along the dam. And he was only 17 years old, and one day a federal inspector came by. I think the union had probably sent him out there, and they discovered that Dad didn't have a chauffeur's license because you had to be 18 to get a chauffeur's license. So this boss, being desperate for help, kindly found a friend in Denver, a friend of his in Denver, that would take my dad in for 2 weeks until he was old enough to get a chauffeur's license. So Dad went and moved in with this lady. She had a spare room, and had nothing to do for a couple of weeks, but he went to the movie a couple of times and just rested and hung out. As soon as he was 18, he got his chauffeur's license, and he went back out onto the job and hauled these big rocks and filled this up and stayed there until the job was done. But this man had another job and offered Dad to take him to California to work on a large project out there. This guy did big government projects wherever. But my dad chose not to go to California. Instead, he came home to join the Navy with his brother Keith. His older brother Keith was going to join the Navy. This was during World War II yet. And so they went together to join the Navy. Well, my dad was rejected and stamped 4F because he had stomach ulcers. But Uncle Keith went off to the Navy, and he became an aircraft electrician. And he served in the Pacific on an aircraft carrier, repairing electrical problems with airplanes. But my dad was stuck here now. The man had left with the job, with the good job that he'd had. So Dad bought him an old truck, and I think it was a Ford Model A, I believe is the story is, and he began to dray locally. Dray is kind of an old term for some of you folks, but anyway, what he did was he hauled ice for ice boxes from the railroad cars, and he hauled coal for the furnaces in most people's house at that time. And this old truck would haul, and it had no dump, no hoist on it, so you had to scoop on the coal, and then you had to scoop the coal back off. And this old truck was not very powerful. He had a regular customer by the name of Dwiggins that lived up on the golf course hill at Gibbon. And that old truck didn't have enough power to get up the hill with a heavy load of coal on the gravel road, but he could turn it around, and reverse was geared lower. So at the bottom of the hill, he'd turn around and then he'd back up this hill about a quarter of a mile. He had to back up, and he'd back in their yard and around to their coal chute and scoop coal into their deal. So, you know, life wasn't necessarily easy, but as times change, pretty soon people didn't want coal anymore. They had propane and they got natural gas, and they didn't need ice anymore. They got a refrigerator that cooled itself. So his business kind of dried up, and so he bought a gas station there in Gibbon, and he opened the gas station July 1st of 1946, and I was born on July 12th of 1946. So I've been in the gas station business all my life until I was 68, I think, when I retired from the gas station business. But, so I was in the gas station business for 68 years, you know, to some degree or another. Sometimes I was pretty small. Soon after that, Dad bought a truck to haul cattle with, and got a few customers, and so he would haul cattle into Omaha at night, and Mom would ride with him and take me along, and the truck had a little sleeper cab, but the roof leaked, and so if we ran into rain, she'd have to move me according to the direction we were going, the wind where the water was dripping in. She'd slide me out of the drips, and then and if it was a nice quiet day, she would sit and splash water in Dad's face to keep him awake so he could get back home to open the gas station the next morning. Well, eventually, then he bought a tank truck and was hauling his gasoline from Cheyenne, Wyoming. If you can imagine how far that is, but he did that on the weekends, and he hired a driver right away then, and he hired a man named Lauren Delmont to do that, and Lauren hauled gas out of Cheyenne on the weekends, or towards the end of the week, and then Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday they usually could get a load of cattle going into Omaha, and Lauren hauled that. So then my dad could stay and work at the station more, and he had a service bin. He could grease your car and change your oil, but it was outside and it had no roof over it. So he usually had his overshoes on because it had either rained in there or snowed in there, whatever. And sometimes when he was greasing the car, the snow was blowing across the neighbor's yard and into his face there. But anyway, shortly after he bought this truck, he had to sell the family car in order to make a truck payment because he didn't want to lose his truck. And he owned an airplane. Since 1940, he's always had an airplane, and that was his love. That was his one extension, one hobby that he had, his one weakness. And he had an airplane until about 1986. And through these tough times, when he needed money to make a truck payment, instead of selling that airplane, which would be kind of hard to sell, he sold the family car. So we lived right, you know, only just across the railroad tracks from town. So my mother had a two-seater baby buggy, and she'd put me in the back seat and push me across to the grocery store, buy groceries, put them in the front seat of this little cart, push us back home. Well, that worked okay for a couple of years, and then my brother came onto the scene, and he needed that front seat to ride. So instead of carrying the groceries, Mom put him in the back seat, the groceries in the front seat, and then I had to walk. From about 2 years old to 4 years old, I had to walk when she went to town for groceries. And then we got rich and got a car again, and so Mom could get groceries. But you know, people in this day and age don't understand what our forefathers went through. I mean, that wasn't very long ago. That was in my lifetime. But then he, during the 1950s, Dad, with all of his energy, was making a little bit of money, and he started trying some other things. He invested in wildcat oil wells and lost a little money there. And he bought an oil refinery in Omaha, and he sent his first truck driver down there to run the oil refinery, and hired another truck driver for his truck. And at this oil refinery, they didn't use crude oil; they used drain oil, and they bought drain oil from the railroad and bus companies and taxi companies, and then they re-refined it. And Dad sold it through the gas station retail, and he also sold it wholesale to other gas stations and so on. And that lasted quite a few years. He finally sold that and it became Warren Distribution, and it became a very large company. But as time progressed, Dad bought a few more trucks, and when my grandpa retired from hauling turkeys into the turkey plant, Grandpa started hauling turkeys in there when that plant opened in 1936, I believe, and then later on in the 60s, my father bought his out, and Earl Dance was out, and Harold Stahl, the original haulers, and we hauled turkeys there, and he lucked into a really good haul for Hormel and Company, hauling hogs, through a friend of his that was the hog buyer. And he bought a couple of trucks for that hog buyer. The hog buyer said, "I have 4 buyers working for me and 2 truck drivers." And he said, "The 2 truck drivers are twice as much work as the 4 hog buyers." So he sold the trucks to Dad. He sold the headaches to Dad, and he kept the good part. But it turned out well for Dad. And ultimately, when he finally quit trucking on December 31st of 1985, he had 9 tractors and 27 trailers that we disposed of all of them but one tractor and 1 trailer, so we could continue hauling gasoline to our station for a while. But after that, Dad and I both got what I kind of refer to as our slowing down sickness. I had a heart attack with cardiac arrest in June of 1986, and then Dad had a heart attack in December of '86. So that's how before that we were just too busy. We couldn't have heart attacks before that. So, and it turned out well. But anyway, after Dad recovered from his heart attack in a few months, he came back and worked at the gas station, and he worked until he was 77 years old, and his health failed, and he got Alzheimer's and couldn't work anymore. And ultimately, he died December 11th, 2005. December 11th was his birthday, his 80th birthday. He was born in 25. And so, and I've written down, as time allows here, I've written down a few of the things that might jog you guys' memories about your dad and your granddad as you take time to think about this. I remember that that sometimes Dad would take Mom and my brother and I into Kearney, and he would get a friend to watch the station, and he brought us up here, and we got on what we called the Tater Bug. It was a railroad passenger car that had its own motor, and it went up the line here to Arnold, and we'd go to Arnold where my mother's parents lived. My mother's dad was a barber up there, and we'd go up there and spend a few days with them and get our hair cut and whatever, and then we'd ride that little Tater Bug back down, and Dad would come to the train station and pick us up. I remember that happening a few times, and I remember once in a while when Dad didn't have to work on a Saturday night or something, we would go down on Central Avenue on the other side of the tracks. There was a little drive-in, I think we called it Ole's. I think the guy's name was Olson or something that ran it, and he had the best fried chicken. It was even better fried chicken than my mother's, and my mother was a pretty decent cook. But and then like I told you before, he always owned that airplane. But one day, well, back while we were in the trucking business, I was coming in one morning from Fremont, been out all night, Fremont, and I looked across from the highway through what was Schuster Implement Company, and there my dad was, and had this truck running, and the exhaust smoke was coming out the front air cleaner. And I knew that he had the engine running backwards. Those Detroit diesels, he was trying to hook up to a loaded trailer, and he got under there and killed the motor, and the trailer pushed him back out, and it restarted in reverse, because the engines were made to run either directions, because sometimes on a bus, they run them a different way than they do a truck, and in some marine applications, they run backwards. Well, I had it happen to me before. He had sent my brother and I and our mechanic to Detroit Diesel Training School a few years before, and they told us that could happen. And it happened to me when I was loading cattle down Grand Island one day, and so I quickly shut it off. But here's my dad out there looking this over, and so I drove down there as fast as I could around the corner and into the lot. I said, "Shut it off, shut it off." No, he said, "I can't shut it off. It probably won't start again." He said, I blew up the motor and tore the transmission out of it, all in the same deal. He said, every gear goes backwards. And he said, and you can see the smoke coming out here. And I said, it's running backwards, turn it off. So he turned it off, and he said, well, because when it was running backwards, even the oil pump was running backwards. Nothing was getting lubricated or anything. Well, but anyway, I happened along just in time to save the engine on that truck. But one other time I remember that him and a friend of his, and sometimes a business partner on some of their deals, they used to feed hogs together and different things that never made much money. But they took my brother and I blue rock shooting out by the sand pit, and they had a hand thrower, and either Clyde or Dad would throw the blue rock, and they'd let me and Si shoot at it with our BB guns, and then they would shoot at it after we missed, which we almost always did, but by then the blue rock had come way down, so they missed it too. But I remember I hit one, and I broke the blue rock in half, and I was so excited. I remember that was one of the highlights of my days. And my father took me fishing one morning before he opened the station. We went out about 5 o'clock out to the local sand pit. Never caught a fish, and that was the only time my dad ever took me fishing. Other than that, my mother always took us. My father was raised as an Adventist until he was about 9 years old. And I don't know where they went to church. They lived at the bottom of Buckeye Road and on 100th Avenue. And I suppose they came to Kearney for church, but I forgot to ask. And now Grandpa's dead, and Dad's dead, and Uncle Ben is dead, and Uncle Ben's kids are dead. And so I don't think there's anybody left that knows if there was a church out there in the country or not. They probably came there to Kearney, but I don't know how they did that in hard times in those early 30s. I don't know how they would have had enough money to buy gas to come to church, but they did. So, but anyway, after they were married and my brother and I were born, we went to the Methodist church because that was my mother's faith. And so I remember that my mother took my brother and I to church virtually every Sunday. And we'd stay for church occasionally, but we fussed too much. Mom kind of gave up on that. But my dad was working Saturdays and Sundays and everything, mostly. But we did usually all go to church like most Christians do today, on Easter and Christmas. And that was about the extent of it. But he was good he did watch a little television preachers, and he was good he would send them money, different ones at different times. And I remember that the only time I ever saw my mother raise her voice to her father was that her father had been sending money to one of these television preachers, and the preacher got into some kind of trouble. I don't remember if it was with women or mishandling the money or whatever, and she was giving Grandpa heck about sending that money to him. And after she was done cutting loose on her dad, right, my dad told her, he said, Grandpa did fine. Grandpa sent the money in good faith. He'll get credit in heaven for that. He said, it's the preacher that has to answer. That was God's money, not Grandpa's money, that that preacher was misusing. And so that was one of my early lessons in Christianity, I guess you would say, that came from there. So, my father, like I say, was 4F from the Navy because he had stomach ulcers and they bothered him for years. Before I was old enough to drive, but old enough to know, I would ride with him, and sometimes we would stop and he would lay out across the street, across the seats or in the bunk, and just put his fists in his stomach to relieve the pain. And he drank a lot of milk and half and so on to soothe that. When we went through Shelby, Nebraska, on our way to Omaha, we always stopped there was a little truck stop there in Shelby, and the lady there would put a raw egg in Dad's chocolate malt that he had for his stomach. And some of the restaurants wouldn't put raw eggs in his malt, so we always stopped at Shelby for a malt. I didn't have to put a raw egg in my malt. Later on, Dad found an ad in a magazine for a product called Pepso Pacific that appeared to heal his stomach ulcer. And he was pretty sure it was healed, but he wasn't positive. So he kept reordering this Pepsi Pacific. And one day he called to order, and the lady says, well, this will be your last order. She said, we're going to close up. Dad said, oh, no, you can't do that. So I said, I got to have this. I said, this is how I live. And she said, well, I'm sorry. She said, we make this out of a seaweed that grows in the Pacific Ocean, and the seaweed is gone out to sea or something, and we don't have any. So Dad ordered a double order, and then he hung up and he thought about that. I might have told you this story before as part of my testimony. But anyway, so he didn't think it sounded quite right. It didn't say on the label there was any seaweed in this stuff. So he called back down there and he asked to talk to the owner. And a man by the name of Charles Knight came on the phone, and he said, well, Dad told him this lady said it's made out of seaweed, you can't get the seaweed. Isn't there some way you can get the seaweed? And Mr. Knight said, well, he said, I don't know why she told you that. She says, it's not a matter of seaweed. He said, it's just a matter that I want to retire, and my son doesn't want the business. And he said, I built it for him, and he doesn't want it. He's in the trucking business someplace. Well, Dad was in the trucking business too, so they conversed, and finally Dad said, well, if your son doesn't want it, would you sell it to me? And Mr. Knight said, yeah, I guessed he would. And so Dad said, well, how much do you want for the company? And the man said he wanted $1 million for the company. Dad said, well, he said, I can't pay that. But he said, is there some way I could just, somehow get to know how to do this? And no, he said, you'd have to buy the whole deal. He said, it's a package deal. So anyway, Dad was very distraught, and he had to hang up the phone, and he thought about that for a little while, and he thought about how bad he used to hurt with those stomach ulcers. And some days later, he called back and talked to Mr. Knight again. He said, now, if you don't get this company sold for your $1 million, he said, give me another chance at it. But he said, in the meantime, if you do sell it, be sure that you let me know where I can get the product if somebody else is making it. And Mr. Knight says, oh, he said, I've been trying to sell it for years. He said, I'm not gonna get it. He said, why don't you make me an offer on the company? And Dad said, well, what's included? And Mr. Knight told him, well, he said, I've got some mixing vats and some material, and he said the know-how and the formula. And Dad thought, I said, well, I'll call you tomorrow. So he called him back the next day, and he offered him $50,000 for this $1 million company. Mr. Knight said, oh no, he said, I can't sell it that cheap, but he said, I can see I'm not going to get what I wanted. And ultimately, Dad ended up buying the company for $100,000. And Mr. Knight came up and brought the formula and showed us how to do it. And we all lived happily ever after. And we set up a laboratory in a room in Dad's house. And the feds came and inspected it and said it's okay to make stuff. And we got to making Pepso Pacific and selling it through direct mail. And we sold it for quite a few years. And one day the federal man come and said, we got to close you down. And Dad said, well, why? He said, you don't have an expiration date on your bottle. Well, then Dad talked to this federal guy about how could we get one? He said, you can hire companies that'll set this up for you and get a reasonable time on it. But he said, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And he said, I'm going to shut you down anyway, because he said, I've got orders to shut you down, and when I leave here, I'm going to go to North Platte and shut down another little company that's selling a similar product, because one of the big drug companies has a product called Prilosec that they want to sell over the counter instead of by prescription, and he said they're going to get their way. So we closed down. We made a huge batch so that we had enough to last all of Dad's life, and we closed it down. But during that time, we sold enough product to get our money back that he'd put in the company, but it never made us any money. So, well, but anyway, I just wanted to tell you all that I was really blessed before birth to have parents as good as my parents. And I got time for one more story. Now, after my dad got Alzheimer's and he was in the care home, I went to visit him a lot. And one day, he told me this story. He said him and his cousin were out. I wish Joy was here, because I can't remember the name of the cousin now, but I did know, and I should know. But anyway, him and his cousin were out hunting for rabbits in the field along there, along the farm. And their Grandpa Charles's dog was running across, playing in an alfalfa field way over there. And the dog was maybe chasing a rabbit. But anyway, his cousin said, he said, watch, I'm gonna scare old Betty. The dog's name was Betty. And he shot his .22 rifle across there to scare the dog, and the dog just tipped over. So they went over there, and the dog was dead. So they swore a pact to never tell anybody about this. And so they wondered for weeks and weeks, the rest of the family wondered what happened to Betty. She didn't come back home from her playing in the hayfield, and they never found out. And so anyway, and Dad said, I've never told anybody till this day. And he was coming in and out of this Alzheimer's, but the story sounded legitimate, like it was really a true story. So anyway, I didn't have a chance to talk to any of the cousins then right away, but Dad passed away, and this story was on my mind, and so I went to one of his cousins. There was two cousins, and it was one of them always hunted with him, and the other guy didn't. But I asked this cousin at a family reunion. I said, "What do you know about what happened to Great Grandpa Charles's dog Betty?" Oh, he didn't know nothing about it. He didn't know nothing about it. And I told him the story that Dad had told me. No, he said, I don't remember anything like that. So I thought, well, maybe I got the wrong cousin. So I went to the other cousin, and he lived way down in Texas, but he happened to be here for a funeral. He said, oh no, he said I didn't go hunting. He said, I wasn't a hunter. He said, that was my brother and your dad. And I said, well, did you ever hear anything about what happened to Betty the dog? No, he said, I remember Betty was missing for a long time and she never did come back. So then later on, I went to the first cousin, the one I was pretty sure it was, and I said, what's the deal here? I said, Dad could have been talking out of his head, but it didn't sound like it. I said, are you sure you don't know anything about what happened to Betty? He said, no. He said, I sure don't know. And now I don't know whether he didn't know if this story just came in Dad's head, or if Dad had shot the dog sometime out by himself accidentally, or if this guy was just keeping his pledge to never tell. And I don't know how that turned out. But anyway, that was my father's story as far as I could tell it. The younger years before I was born, he would have to tell that, and we're going to miss out. So.